Hi, I'm David Ryan Barcega Castro-Harris, all five names for all the ancestors. I'm here to help you cultivate relationships rooted in accountability and care, and this is restorative justice support. Today, I'm answering questions about restorative justice in elementary schools. So let's get to it. First question, what is restorative justice in kid-friendly terms? How would you explain it to a kindergartner versus a fifth grader? Great question. First, I think we need to define restorative justice in general. So, Howard Zur, someone who's described as the grandfather of the modern day restorative justice movement, defined restorative justice as a process to involve, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in a specific offense and to collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things as right as possible. And that definitely defines a restorative justice process, but I take a little bit more of a holistic approach to this. I think about restorative justice as a philosophy and set of practices rooted in indigenous values of interconnection that emphasize repairing relationships when harm occurs, but proactively builds and strengthens relationships rooted in equity and trust in order to prevent future harm. And so when you're explaining these ideas to young people, whether they're in your classroom or in other spaces, I would really focus on the relationships, right? How do we want to be together in a good way? For kids of any age, it might be, what are expected behaviors? What will we do when things go wrong? And how are we going to fix problems? But the emphasis has to be on relationship. It's not actually important to me as a restorative justice practitioner that kindergartners or fifth graders actually know the word restorative justice. What's important is that they're building relationships in a good way. They're cultivating relationships with each other and with you to make sure that there is trust there. So people know what behavior are expected of them. They know what to do when they need to get support, and they know what to do when harm or conflict happens, and they can address that in a positive way instead of causing more harm with punishment or ignoring the problem. If this was helpful, follow along for more insights on restorative justice. How is restorative justice different from being nice? Hate is a strong word, but I hate the framing of nice. Nice usually implies being sweet or going with the flow and keeping the peace, right? Not causing a disturbance, not causing people discomfort. And that is not at all what restorative justice is about. Restorative justice is compassionate. Restorative justice is about meeting the needs of people in your community, but it's also about meeting your own needs. And so if something is happening to you that's causing you harm and you want to be nice and not inconvenience anyone, that's not building a good relationship rooted in equity and trust, right? If your needs are not being met and you're not voicing them, first of all, you're probably suffering in some way because your needs aren't being met. And second of all, you're taking away from the other person you're in relationship with the ability to meet your needs, the ability to be in good relationship with you. So restorative justice is not at all about being passive or letting things go or not naming uncomfortable topics or situations that might cause discomfort. So then the question becomes, when we're addressing harm or addressing issues in our communities or in our relationships, how are we framing them with compassion? How are we offering support in addition to setting expectations or upholding expectations to make sure that people are getting their needs met to the extent possible? So if someone takes your pencil or steps on your shoe or says a mean comment to you and you want to be nice and not get them in trouble and not disturb the peace, that's not restorative justice, right? That's allowing that harmful behavior to continue. We want to make sure that we're identifying and addressing harm, right? Going back to that definition that Howard Zur framed for a restorative process, identifying and addressing the harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things as right as possible. We want to make sure that everyone, young people included, are developing agency to name harm and then be able to step into processes where that harm is being addressed, where that conflict is being addressed. If this was helpful, follow along for more insights on restorative justice. Why is restorative justice better than traditional discipline in schools? Well, of course, as somebody who is a restorative justice practitioner, I'm going to say that restorative justice is better. But let's break down some of those words in that question. When we say discipline, if we take the word discipline back to its Latin roots, it's about the process of teaching. And you can teach in any way. When we think about the purpose of education or schooling in our context, it's about producing workers to enter the workforce. And good workers are compliant. They will follow the rules or the guidelines and produce what they're supposed to produce, whether that is widgets or services in whatever workplace they go into. And the way that we've been taught to incentivize that is with fear, right? Fear of what will happen to you if you break the rules or step out of line or do things that you're not supposed to do. And restorative justice teaches the opposite of that. And so if you, in the core of your being, are advocating for, yes, as an educator, my job is to produce cogs in the capitalist workforce, then I think maybe traditional methods of discipline rooted in fear and control might be the better option for you. But if you're looking to help young people develop into conscious, thoughtful, critical thinking human beings who value relationships, and if you want them to navigate the world with care and compassion, restorative justice practices are a lot more conducive to help you achieving those goals. When you have people who are willing to problem solve and get to the root of the problem instead of disposing of people or kicking people out when things go wrong, you're actually giving them skills to critically think and compassionately meet each other's needs. When we're thinking about ways that we're collaborating to build relationships rooted in equity and trust, we're teaching them teamwork and shared responsibility. Traditional or punitive versions of discipline in the school system might lead to more compliance, but I don't think traditional or punitive discipline is the best thing to use to help young people cultivate a sense of care, community, compassion, and justice. If this was helpful, follow along for more insights on restorative justice. So can you still have rules with restorative justice? Depends on what you mean by rules. Usually with restorative justice frameworks in mind, we come to community agreements about how we want to be in relationship with each other. So in the context of a classroom, it's how do we want to treat each other? What do you need as a student? What do I need as a teacher? Remember, you are a full participant in your classroom, and so you get to ask your students to treat you in the ways that you want to be treated, just like you want to ask them how they want to be treated, what they need from their teacher, what they need from each other in the classroom. You might say as a teacher, when you enter the classroom, I need you to be quiet. And you have to be really specific about what quiet means, because some people might interpret that as I'm going to whisper or I'm going to talk softly when you meant silent. And I'm not saying that's necessarily your specific rule, but explaining explicitly what you mean and the why behind it is important. If you say, I want you to enter the classroom quietly and 20 students are whispering, that's actually not that quiet. But if you're saying to your students, I want you to enter the classroom silently so we can get settled in our seats and start with a mindful moment together and use our time as efficiently as possible, then you're rooting that request framed as a rule in a need, and people are a lot more likely to want to comply. If you come to a community agreement about coming into the classroom silently, when people are out of line with that, your approach is what happened? Why are you out of line with this agreement? What's the impact? Oh, our class time is delayed, or our mindful moment time is delayed. There's a disturbance in the classroom. What needs to happen in order to make things right as possible? Maybe an apology or a reminder to not do that the next time, and we move on. But a rule is often using a punitive approach, saying this rule is broken, go stand outside the classroom or go have detention, go to the principal's office, not really addressing that person's need or the needs of the classroom. It's just kicking somebody out of the classroom, not really addressing what might have been behind that whispering behavior. It might have been someone forgot. It might have been that someone had something really important that they wanted to share. But I understand within the construct of schools, rules exist. Making sure that you explain rules and get people's consent or get people's buy-in from the beginning is important, and following up in a way that is emphasizing relationships and needs instead of focusing on punishment is really important. If this was helpful, follow along for more insights on restorative justice. Isn't restorative justice just letting kids get away with bad behavior? Kids need consequences. I'm 100% with you. Kids do need consequences. And if we take that word consequence, whatever happens next, there are always consequences. If you have a student who gets really upset and kicks you in the shin, there are natural consequences to that. You're going to be physically in pain because little kids can kick pretty hard, they might have some natural physical consequences as well. Your shin bone's pretty hard, their foot might hurt. You're going to be in a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. They're also going to be on edge as well. But everything that comes after that is a choice. You could put your hands on them and be physical with them to remove the immediate threat. You could call for help. You could back away. You could try to de-escalate the situation with your words. But all of those are choices, and there will be consequences to your choices after that. If you want to take a restorative approach, you're much more likely going to try to de-escalate the situation and try to figure out what the underlying needs were and try to figure out how you can both prioritize your safety and your student's safety and the regulation and give your student tools to regulate moving forward. With a punitive approach, you're just kicking that kid out of your class. And that's not necessarily going to lead to those needs being addressed. There are instances where you do need some time and space from people, but the way that you go about creating that time and space and what you do in the follow-up with that matters. Remember, with restorative justice, we're always thinking about what is the impact on the relationship. Are we building a trusting, caring relationship where there is accountability going both ways? If this was helpful, follow along for more insights on restorative justice. Is restorative justice developmentally appropriate for little kids? Let's go back to the definition of restorative justice that I use. Restorative justice is a philosophy and set of practices rooted in indigenous values of interconnection that emphasize repairing relationships when harm occurs while proactively building and strengthening relationships rooted in equity and trust to prevent future harm. Really, all we're talking about is how are we in good relationship together? It's not the most important thing for students, especially young kids, to know the history and the background of restorative justice. But you do want students to be in good relationship with you and good relationship with each other and in good relationship with themselves. And there are developmentally appropriate ways to do that. So the way that you talk to a 5-year-old about treating everyone with kindness and with respect is different than the way that you would talk to a 10-year-old about being responsible for your own actions and being a contributing member of their community. But the formal language of restorative justice is not important. The way that you embody restorative justice and the way that you teach others to follow your model is important. When we're thinking about engaging in formal restorative justice practices like a talking circle, the topics that you introduce or the amount of time that you're expecting people to be able to sit still and hold attention are going to be different depending on the age of your students. But as a teacher who knows what's developmentally appropriate for your students, you can adapt those practices appropriately. When going through a restorative process to repair harm, a 5-year-old or 6-year-old might have a little bit harder of a time being able to name the impact of their actions. And so you might not ask open-ended questions. You might give them choices or might coach them into thinking about the consequences of their actions, whereas a 4th grader, 5th grader might not need that much coaching, but we're just adapting being in good relationship with each other, cultivating relationship, building, strengthening, and repairing a relationship when it comes down to age-appropriate context. And you already do that every day. If this was helpful, follow along for more insights on restorative justice. What is age-appropriate language to name harm with my students in a restorative way? Super important question. And I want to answer it simply by saying, name the harm. Naming the harm does not mean judging someone. It does not mean shaming someone. It doesn't mean labeling someone. It's saying, this is what happened, right? So I saw you push your friend on the playground. I see you taking your friend's scissors. I see you talking while I'm talking. That is just naming the harm. That is appropriate language that everyone understands. The tone that you use with that can be restorative or judgy, but a restorative way of naming harm is simply just to name the harm without judgment. You're just making the observation of the facts of what happened. You're not assigning blame or judgment. You're not saying, what did you do? Or you're so disruptive, or you're so lazy. You're a bad kid. You're naming the harm that happened. Maybe you're also reminding them of the expectation. And maybe it's just a redirect into doing what's expected of them. Maybe it's following up with a question on, hey, what's going on? Why are you doing that? Or what do you think the impact of this action is? What do you think you need to do in order to make things right or as right as possible? But the framing of that is pretty straightforward. Name the harm in a non-judgmental way and follow up with curiosity. If this was helpful, follow along for more insights on restorative justice. What does a restorative classroom actually look and sound like? Well, depending on the school that you're in, depending on the age that you teach, depending on who you are as a person, it could look like a lot of things in the specifics. But I want to talk about some broad, general behaviors that I would look for. First of all, let's operate from the definition of restorative justice being about building, strengthening, as well as repairing relationships when conflict and harm occur. So, in order to minimize the opportunities for conflict and harm to occur, there are a lot of things that you want to be doing proactively. First of all, are you cultivating a sense of welcome and belonging in your classroom? There are formal practices in the way that that looks. The way that you greet students coming in, is that making them feel welcome, valued, and seen? Are you cultivating opportunities for them to interact with each other where they're building relationships? That could look like a number of different icebreaker activities or community building circles. Do you all have agreements about what behavior is expected inside the classroom, right? Did you come up with those agreements together, or did you, as their teacher, just lay down those expectations and expect them to fall in line, right? A restorative environment is really about building community, and it could look like any number of those practices. Another behavior that exists in restorative classroom environments are check-in practices, both on an emotional level to see how students are coming into your classroom, because their feelings are going to impact the way that they show up and behave in your classroom. And it's better to know those things ahead of time if there are going to be problems rather than having to encounter them and address them in the moment. Check-ins not only proactively build relationships and help develop emotional vocabulary, they also help you identify problems before they become full-blown crises where more conflict and harm occur. There's also an element of student participation and student ownership. Of course, there are learning objectives that you have to achieve, but what are the ways that you're inviting student voice in contributing to how you go about learning those things, how you're evaluating those things, and allowing them to follow their own curiosity using the skills and gifts that they have as individuals? All of those things contribute to individual students developing a sense of self-worth and belonging. And when that happens, they're more willing to participate in the life of contributing to the classroom community, preventing conflict and harm for the most part. Inevitably, when people are together, there will be conflict and harm. And so making sure that students are informed of the ways that you will address conflict and harm when it happens, both between them and between you and them, right? Leaning into restorative practices instead of punitive practices, and also instead of ignoring the problem or being permissive. It should be an established practice in your classroom that when harm or conflict occur, you or students are able to name it, know who to go to name it, and get support for addressing it, whether that is through a facilitated restorative conversation, a talking circle, maybe a class-wide conversation, readjusting expectations or reminding people of expectations, or something else entirely. And those conversations happen as often as they need to. Of course, there are factors outside of your classroom that could make that more or less difficult, but you have a tremendous amount of agency as a teacher in your classroom to develop that environment and those practices that I just named. If this was helpful, follow along for more insights on restorative justice. How do you get your whole class on board with restorative justice? Well, I don't think that it is your responsibility to get everybody to philosophically agree with the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice as a classroom teacher. Your job is to model and uphold the expectations that you co-create. Getting everybody on board philosophically, whether it's in the context of your classroom or school-wide, or for us as a broader community, might not be realistic. But what is realistic is to get people to understand the importance of behaving in a certain way for the benefit of everybody in our community. Some students might not need convincing at all. But for the students who are having the hardest time wanting to feel like contributing members of your community, for the students who have specific individual needs that they're wanting to prioritize over everybody else's, you're going to need some additional support there. And going through that process and bringing them along is in and of itself restorative. Let's say you have one student or a couple students who are not on board with your classroom agreements and who are routinely acting outside of those agreements. You get to use that restorative framing of what happened, who's impacted and how, and what needs must be addressed in order to make things right or as right as possible. We have this group of students who are constantly talking out of turn and fighting between each other. That is what's happening. What's the impact of that? Class time is being disrupted. Instruction isn't happening. Their classmates are worried about harm that might come to them or are just annoyed. Highlighting that to them as the impact of their actions might be really helpful. And some of them still might say, I don't care. And while they might not care about the needs of everybody else in the class, they do care about their own needs to some extent. And so highlighting their needs and what the impact is on them when they're continuing in this way might be helpful. You're falling behind in instruction. Your classmates might not want to talk to you or might not want to be friends with you or might not want to sit next to you if you're continuing to act in this way. And I know you want to be in good relationship with them. So focusing on those behaviors and the impact on them might be another good way to go about that. And this isn't to shame them or to vilify them, but it's just to help them understand these are the impacts. This might bring up some strong feelings, and restorative justice processes are not about protecting people from feeling strong feelings, but being able to sit with those students and help them process those feelings and get to the other side of them where we're addressing their feelings and their needs is what's important. Not for the end goal of them being restorative justice practitioners, but for the sake of let's build a restorative classroom environment where people are getting their needs met to the extent possible. If this was helpful, follow along for more insights on restorative justice. What do I do if my school is still suspending kids and referring kids to detention? That's a real question. And I'm assuming you're asking it from a place of, I don't believe in suspension and detention, but I'm working in the system that does. What do I do? One, you have a tremendous amount of agency to not make referrals. You can do everything that you can within your power to deal with those situations inside the context of your classroom. When you're building those relationships with your students, you're often preventing those things, those referral-worthy behaviors from happening. And it's inevitably the case that there will be something that school policy dictates that you need to make a referral for. And then you just get to make the choice whether or not you want to be compliant with policy or stand in restorative values. And I'm not here to tell you to do one thing or the other. I'm here to have you reflect on what is the impact of my referral going to be? Is it going to meet the needs of the people involved, or is it just going to cause more harm? You also have to make the calculation, do you have the capacity to meet the needs of the people involved? And if the answer is no, you might actually make the choice to go get outside support, even if it means activating a response that does look like punishment. What you then get to do on the other side of that punishment is figure out ways to still continue to repair and meet those needs. Definitely not an easy question to answer, and you're going to make decisions on a case-by-case basis. If you're going to make the decision whether or not to initiate the referral, the questions that I would ask you are, what is the impact of me initiating this referral? And do I have the capacity to handle this within the context of my classroom and with my relationship with the students involved? If this resonated, follow for more restorative justice insights. Let me know what you want me to answer next time in the comments, and check out the video on your screen to learn more about restorative justice. If you want more support bringing restorative justice to your school or classroom, visit amplifyrj.com for more information.